bricking circle does, that sort of investment in public history is really just not happening these days. So thank you. It is with great delight that I'm introducing today's talk and chairing today's session and introducing Dr. Samia Khatun to us, to the audience today. I'm really not going to be talking much. I'm just going to be reading off a sheet and just explaining who Samia is. The talk today is Australianama, Bengali Sufi poetry in the Australian Outback. And our speaker is a writer, filmmaker, historian, born in Dhaka, completed a PhD in history at the University of Sydney and soon to develop a history program at the University of Liberal Arts in Bangladesh. And it's really, I mean, the only thing that I do want to sort of kick off by, before I let Samia kick off, is to say that this really is pioneering scholarship. And I'm really excited about this. So, Samia, please.
Thank you so much, Lily. It's a real pleasure to be here. I was actually just travelling through London on holidays and then found some amazing stuff in the British Library and ended up extending my stay and then ended up getting, you know, hooked into the right networks of people talking about things, and this came up. So it's what you're about to hear is from my forthcoming book, and it's literally just been finished on July 31st. So this is the first time I'm presenting in spoken form, so some of the ideas may not have made a smooth transition. Just look confused, and I'll try and slow down. And also I have a very thick Australian accent and I speak quite fast sometimes, so do look confused if you get lost, and I will slow down. So I'm going to be talking for probably around about 50 minutes to an hour, and that should give us plenty of time for questions and discussion afterwards. So, Australian desert, this is what it looks like. If you travel inland from Sydney for over 1,000 kilometres, over the Blue Mountains, past the trees that drink the Darling River, a little red mosque marks where the Australian desert begins. From corrugated iron, the mosque was built in 1887 in the town of Broken Hill. Today, its shelves house stories that were once very precious to people from across the Indian Ocean. Now, it's not that much used, but it remains as a place of retreat from the gritty dust storms and brilliant sunlight at this gateway to Australian deserts. Now, there are many of these little mosques throughout Australian deserts, and the one in Broken Hill that you're going to hear about is one of the ones that's been most carefully looked after by the local History Council. And this is in part because Broken Hill is it's built on the land of Whitechapel people, which is the Aboriginal family who still, many of whom still are there. It's actually a really important place in the history of settler colonialism in Australia. It's the birthplace of the mining company Broken Hill Proprietary Limited, or BHP. Now, they're a parent company for the mining conglomerate BHP Billiton, which is the largest mining company in the world today. So the story that's usually told about these mosques that you can find throughout Australia is that they were built during the camel transportation era. It's a story that's very neatly told in the picture here. Next slide, please. So here you see, this is a picture from 1893 in the port of Adelaide, and you can see a camel being unloaded into Port Adelaide, and the ship is actually the steamship Bengal, and you can see there's a whole number of people with turbans, clearly South Asians, waiting waiting for the camel. From 1860, camels began to be exported from South Asia to Australia. They formed the backbone of the Outback transportation system. So all BHP steel, all BHP minerals, all the pastoral industries, everything is actually relying on camels. And who's driving the camels? It's these people that you see here. So the people working the camels, the South Asians, today are referred to as the Afghans. And they came from what is today Pakistan, North India and Afghanistan, or so goes the story. From the 1890s, increasingly harsh race-based immigration restriction attempted to stop the movement of South Asians. In 1901, what is known as the White Australia policy is enacted, and it's a series of legislated attempts to have race-based exclusion at Australian borders. And to this day, as many of you will know, Australia remains one of the most racist countries in terms of its immigration and in terms of its border policies. And it goes back to this moment, actually, that history. The thing is, the camel industry is one that continued to have South Asians and Muslims, various Aboriginal people, working it and continued to be a non-white industry throughout the White Australia period. So it's quite a special industry. So in the 19th century, like today, Australia often operated as an Anglo-imperial outpost in the Indian Ocean world. If you go to the next slide. Here is a map that gives us a glimpse into the role that Australia long played in Anglo-imperial designs. Oops, it's gone to the... Oh, please stay. So here, this is a map of the Indian archipelago by... oh no, how do we... So this is by the... Oop!
I have no idea what's happening. A what?
Somehow gone on to...
Oh, is that? Okay. Okay.
Please. No!
Keep it like this. That's
Yeah,
okay.
of course, much easier. So here, in 1848, Thomas Mitchell, the Surveyor General of New South Wales, mapped the stretch of sea that goes from the Bay of Bengal all the way to Australia, and he proposed that we call it the Indian Archipelago. Now, anyone who knows about that region, the Indian Archipelago is actually the name of the islands that are today Indonesia. It's Dutch-controlled territory. So the whole idea of making a map like this is about British imperial penetration into Dutch-owned, Dutch-controlled territories, and it gives you this notion of the role that Australia is playing in British imaginations, of the role that it can play in the Indian Ocean. But while the Indian archipelago didn't sort of take off as a lived idea in Australian white imaginations, this is a geography that many South Asians lived across in the 19th century. Now, in July 2009, I travelled to the particular 19th century mosque in Broken Hill that I was telling you about because I noticed a very intriguing mention of this mosque in an Australian history book. According to a 1989 history book about the camel industry, there was a Quran in this mosque. If we could go to the next slide. Now, there was the most horrific dust storm underway when I arrived to this mosque, and searching amongst the peacock feather fans and the bottles of scent and many letters, these mosques have all these treasures in them really, I found this book. It's this giant book, and it had handwritten on it the Holy Quran. But turning the very first pages revealed that it was not a Quran, but it was actually a 500-page volume of Bengali Sufi poetry. Now, sitting on the floor, I began to read Bangla characters that I had not read since I left Dhaka at the age of 7. Now, the book was titled Qasas Al-Anbiya, and you can see the seal there. That's the title page of it. It was printed in Calcutta in the Bottola industry of cheap book production. It's a compendium of 8 volumes published separately between 1861 and 1895. So it's actually 8 books in one. And there are 3 different poets, and they all claim that the poetry is a translation from Persian into Bangla. Now, the style of the verse is what's called puthi poetry, so it's actually meant to be performed out loud and it's not meant to be read silently. So audiences would gather to listen to this poetry. And every story begins by naming the meter at which it should be sung, so poyar, tripodi, etc. And it's actually very similar in style in many ways to the Mongol Kabbo genre, which is usually associated with Hindu deities and various other folk tales in Bengal. The language of this book is hard. It took me a very long time to learn to read it, and you have to sound it out because it's meant to be recited. So once you actually start hearing the rhythms, that's when you can get what it's trying to say. Now, the very first poet is called Munshi Razaullah, and he opens the very first book with the claim that the very first thing created was a pen. And we'll keep coming back to this pen today to have a think about what he's doing. Munshi Razaullah wrote that a hidden pen inscribed onto a concealed tablet the design of the very stage on which history would unfold. As this pen writes and writes in the poetry, 7 lands take shape under 7 skies, oceans rise and rivers begin to flow, and they flow past the deserts. Over the pages that follow, Adam meets Purusha, Alexander the Great searches for the immortal Khizr, Zulaikha falls hopelessly in love with Yusuf, and of course there's many stories from the lifetime of Muhammad during the 7th century on the Common Era calendar. Now, I don't know whether you can see on that seal, you probably can't, but there's actually 3 calendars in operation in the book. So the book is telling stories according to the Bangla calendar, it's telling stories according to the Common Era calendar, and it also tells stories according to, of course, the Muslim calendar. And the stories actually switch between all 3 temporalities. It's just a confounding, complicated, wonderful book of poetry. Containing stories about the past that have long circulated across the Indian Ocean, it turned out that sitting in that mosque, what I was reading was a Bangla book of popular history. Now, since the 1960s, 4 different Australian writers have mislabelled this Qasas al-Anbiya. It's been called a Quran within English language histories of South Asian diaspora, which are structured around quite a particular set of questions, a set of questions that haunts minority history today. The question is, were they pioneers or were they aliens, right? It's this question of, are the Muslims insiders or outsiders to the nation? Are they a model minority or an undesirable other? Now, this is a question that's obviously a very familiar one also here in Britain, and a question that increasingly actually shapes history books as Islam versus the West has become a binary that organises Anglophone public thought and discourse. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but within the mode of history books in which this book gets mislabelled, historians don't really ask complex questions about the intellectual traditions or cultural traditions of colonised peoples. They systematically sort of transform these kinds of books into dead objects that sort of belong to the traditional past rather than the modern future. Now, the presence of this thing in Broken Hill, for me, raised a number of new questions, made it possible to start asking a whole range of other things that you can ask about South Asians in the West. Now, if this mosque, for example, was built by those camel drivers who are known as Afghans, how on earth did a book get from Bengal to Broken Hill? Bengal does not really sustain a significant camel industry, as far as I know. Now, what role can history books that South Asians bring to the West actually play in the history books that we write about South Asian diaspora? Now, let me just say something about the magic of history books, which I'm really interested in as a historian, obviously. The magic of history books lies in their capacity to enable audiences to time travel. They imaginatively transport readers to the past, and the most compelling history books will insert you into these pathways that connect past, present, and future. So the secret power of history books is that they have the capacity to transform your understanding of the route that you're travelling from yesterday to today to tomorrow. They have the capacity to shape what kind of futures you can envision and even see. So I wanted to know, what kind of storytelling strategies are the authors of Qasas al-Anbiya using, and can we use them to tell stories about the past today? Or why can't we use them to tell stories about the past today? Now, it's very tempting to say that in Australia it's just the linguistic Anglocentrism that means this book has been ignored by historians. You know, they only just speak English. No one knew Bangla, so they didn't know that it wasn't a Quran. But the transformation of colonised people's knowledge systems into dead objects is actually far, far more complicated than language proficiency. Now, you know, and this is obviously something that happens right across the British Empire. It's not specific to South Asia. So, for instance, when Captain James Cook arrives to Australia on 19th April 1770, you know, he pens in his diary that the Britons were, quote, the first who discovered this land that he describes as New Holland. Now, what's he doing? His words are implying the relevance of Aboriginal people's knowledge of the coasts that they'd long cultivated, storied and lived in. And as one correspondent wrote to London from on board the Endeavour, the name of the ship that arrived to Australia, there was a fine library of natural history on board the ship, okay? So it was the tables and classification systems that colonisers bring with them that they view the land through. And he writes very explicitly, you know, we met people who spoke 700 different languages and I didn't understand a single one of those languages, and I don't, you know, we're not interested. So it's the colonial headspace through which people encounter others. Now, the fact that it's actually not about language proficiency becomes really clear if we look at the very earliest reading of the Qasas al-Anbiya by a historian writing in English. If we have the next slide. So this is a reading of the Qasas al-Anbiya in 1864, and only like 3 years after it's actually first published, a copy is acquired for the Library of the Asiatic Society in Bengal. Okay, it's the first Orientalist institution, and it trains employees of the East India Company in South Asian languages. The librarian was Rajendra Lal Mitra. He was a historian of early India and trained as an Orientalist scholar. Now, he was proficient in Hindi, Urdu, Bangla, Sanskrit, Arabic, Persian, French, Greek, Latin, in addition to English. So in 1864, he reproduced an excerpt from the Qasas al-Anbiya in this article published in the Journal of Asiatic Society. Now, tabulating the poetry, what he does is his reading categorises each word as either Bengali or foreign. So you'll see F, 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 B. Okay? Now, firstly, what a weird thing to do to Sufi poetry, in my opinion. But what he's doing in classifying poetry, classifying words with Sanskrit roots as Bengali and Persian and Arabic roots as foreign, is he's of course partitioning the poetry into Hindu and Muslim elements. In addition, he's actually also inserting the story into another historical narrative that may not be clear to you all. Let me just tell you about it. James Mill, in 1817, writes a book called The History of British India. And it partitions, it's one of these books that absolutely everyone who's training for the East India Company have to read after that point. And what it does is it partitions the history of South Asia into three. It says, first, there was a golden age of ancient Hindus. And then there was this age of decay where Muslim foreigners arrive, and there is decay, and that's when everything goes bad. Then there are the British, and they come and they sort of, lead South Asia into enlightened civilization. And this three-part sort of separating of South Asian pasts is actually what historian Rajendra Lal Mitra ends up sort of squeezing this story into when he's calling things Bengali and foreign. And it's a very, 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 powerful story that still today structures how people talk about the past in South Asia. Now, this tells us so little about the stories that the poetry itself tells or how the imagery works. Instead, what it does is it stops the imagery of the poetry from actually doing its work, which is supposed to be to transport you to the past, right? Imaginatively make you see things. Now, if we think about the space across South Asia and Australia then, we see that in Broken Hill, this book is kind of becoming a dead object because historians just aren't reading it and they just ignore it. In South Asia, on the other hand, the poetry becomes a dead object because of the way they read it. It's not as if they're not reading it. They actually read this text again and again and again because it's come at a time when they're very worried about seditious literature. So they actually read anything that they think is Muslim Bengali very carefully. Now, what I'm going to suggest to you today is that the imagery that we're going to go through in the Qasas al-Anbiya actually shows us a different way to read texts, a different way to relate to stories without reducing stories to objects that have no place in the future. And I'm particularly interested, I guess, in what I think of kind of as a knowledge relation, and that's a relationship between humans and books. Like, what do you actually do when you come across the knowledge of another? What do you do when you come across Aboriginal knowledge? Or what do you do when you come across knowledges produced by enslaved peoples in the Caribbean or South Asia? So if I talk about the knowledge relation, that's what I'm talking about. But let's get into the poetry. Let's take a look at the imagery that the poetry shows you about how to inhabit a relationship with stories, okay? It appears on the first few pages of the book in an autobiographical section titled The Story of the Poet and an Account of Translating Books. And it's written by the first poet, Munshi Razaullah. Now I think if we could go to the next slide. Oh, actually, if we could go to that one. Hey, thank you. Oh, it may be too small for you to read, but I'm going to translate it anyway. So we've got this autobiographical section about how the poet comes to be a poet, because this is his first book. He very much says, I've never written a book of poetry before. How am I going to do this? So he constructs an elaborate metaphor for translating Persian books into Bangla. He tells us that his spiritual guide, Bir Sheikh Chand Dada, and his friend, publisher Qazi Sofiuddin, both urged him to translate stories of the prophets from Persian to Bangla. Overwhelmed by the task, Razaullah replied, quote, I'm so ignorant, in what form will I write poetry? End quote. Submitting to a higher power, he realised, quote, whatever, whomever you search, the protector grants. So placing his faith in this logic, the poet writes, quote, I leapt into the sea. Searching for pearls, I began threading a chain. Stories of the prophets, I named this chain. Now I'm just going to read it in Bangla for anyone who can't see it, because there will be people amongst you who know Bangla. Here we go. So he's gone. Jesai Jaban Allah jar tore dilo. Shunia tader kotha hoilo muji bhari. Listening to their words, I became very happy. Yes, I will write a book. Ami oti mukhu kori ki rupe shairi. Bhabi mone Allah bine nahi moddogar. Jeba jaha dhore tare daye porwar. সেই ভরসাতে আমি উম্মেদ রাখিয়া সমুদ্রে দিনু ছাপ কোমর বান্ধিয়া মতি হাতরিয়া হার গাথিতে লাগিনু কাসাস লাম্বিয়া নাম হারের রাখিনু. So that's how he's put together how he becomes a poet, okay? Now here, the imagery of Munshi Razaullah's body immersed in the sea, stringing together pearls, works by evoking another image. It actually evokes a pen dipped in an inkwell, stringing together lines of poetry. but it takes you a long time to be able to see it. It operates according to the rules of Persian poetry. Okay, this is a dense metaphor that sort of rewards slow, repeated readings. Okay. And like the best poetry, it can have many meanings, and every time you come back to it, you see something different. I read this thing for 7 years, so I can see it's like a three-dimensional movie in my head, which I can't quite get you to today, unfortunately. Now, one reading is here. Through this metaphor, Razaullah is actually showing us how to relate to Sufi poetry through his own account of how he related to the Persian Sufi tales that he read when writing the Bengali Sufi. Now, one of the ways that you know that he's doing something very special here is the way that he uses the terms Rup and Nama together, okay? So he's gone, Ami oti mukhu kori ki rupe shayari bhabi mone Allah bine nahi moddogar jeba jahe dhare tare daye porwar সেই ভরসাতে আমি উম্মেদ রাখিয়া সমুদ্রে দিনু ছাপ কোমর বাঁধিয়া. Okay, so Qasasul Anbiya Nam Harer Rakhinu. Okay, so the question he set up is Ami oti mukhu kori ki rupe shayari. In what form, what rup will I translate? And the answer he eventually gives is that, you know, the form is these pearls that I'm going to string from the ocean floor into a chain, and I'm going to name it Qasasul Anbiya. Now, any time in Persian poetry written in South Asia, this is Persian poetry in South Asia specifically, okay? Anytime you see Rup and Nama used together, what they're doing, they're actually theorizing knowledge itself. It's a Buddhist technique. It comes from Buddhist philosophy. So and this is something that Aditya Behel, the cultural historian, writes about if anyone wants to follow up how this stuff actually works. The way that so what does he write? Let me just read you what I've written so you get it. So in various South Asian philosophical traditions, Rupa and Nama signpost theorizations of that relationship between humans and knowledge. This has been happening at least since the Upanishad corpus of Sanskrit texts from 400 BC. And Aditya Behel writes that Nama and Rupa are widely used in Indian traditions to articulate quite different modes of the relation between mind, body, consciousness, as well as to reflect the shape and form of the cosmos itself and its relationship to the embodied human being. Big things, right? All I'll tell you for now is that if you stare at that image of him jumping into the ocean and it's sort of a pen dipped in an inkwell in his writing, what you see is the process of him becoming a munshi. So his name is Munshi Razaullah, which is a munshi is a scribe. That's a title for a state scribe. It's a man of the pen, and so what you end up seeing is the word munshi is etymologically related to the word insha, as in inshallah, Allah willing, right? So munshi is the creator of insha. So if you concentrate on the image long enough, you get to see the creator of insha. You get to see munshi and insha happening at once, and it follows very complex logics of Persian poetry, but you can get there. But the more important thing for me, I mean, the imagery was, you know, mind-boggling, like, oh wow, he's really doing some clever stuff here. But what it's actually telling you, 6 pages into the book, it's on page 6, what it's actually telling you, it's hinting you that the pages of poetry that follow are best interpreted if you read, recite or listen to them whilst asking questions. Because he's actually saying whatever you search for is what you will find, you know. I knew this and then I jumped into the poetry. So he's saying, you too, whatever you search for, you will find, jump into the, you know, the following pages of poetry. It's a schema for how to read the thing. When in July 2009, when I first encountered this book, I could barely read Bangla because I left Dhaka, as I said, when I was 7 years old. Now, overwhelmed with the task of reading how to read this book, I began trawling the archival records, you know, mosque records, shipping records, looking for the person back in the 19th century who could read this book. I can't. Maybe I can find the person who can. That was sort of the logic. And slowly it dawned on me that somehow the poetry had scripted me into the narrative logic that Rezaullah actually shows in his imagery, for I had stepped into the imaginative world of the poetry, grappling with a series of very hard questions. Who bought this book from Bengal to Broken Hill? How do we write histories of South Asian diaspora that pay attention to the history books that travelled with them? But as you've heard, Rezaullah tells us that whatever you search for, you will find. So believing in it, I just kept going. Now, you've heard something of the way that Munshi Rezaullah told his own story. Let's now have a look at how he actually tells stories about the prophets, or stories about the past. Now, what I'm interested in here is less what he's telling the story of rather than how he tells the story, but you'll get this. Let's look at Adam. Now, the Qasas al-Anbiya became a very popular title in the decades following the upheaval of the Sepoy Rebellion or Mutiny of 1857. Now, in its aftermath, the era of East India Company rule in alliance with the Mughal court was brought to an end, and the British Raj was established, right, in 1859. And it just initiates a whole new regime of imperial rule. An entire colonial surveillance infrastructure emerged at this time around seditious literature, because they're all worried that there's going to be another mutiny. So what you actually get at this time is very detailed descriptions of colonial officers writing down when people are sitting around listening to this kind of poetry, like reams and reams and reams. So here's one in 1879. One British administrator reported, quote, frequently Mohammedan natives collect around a tailor or native grocer's shop to hear a man reading a tale in the Musalmani Bengali. He observed that performers had a, quote, fluency of reading which is always rapid, sonorous and musical, accompanied with rapid motions of the head and body, end quote. And the way they tabulate these Bengali books and the performances after 1857 confirms that they go, oh, these are Muslims and these are Hindus. So they start separating out which community is performing around which book, and you really start seeing their tabulation. You know, some of it's quite hilarious. So when British officers saw watching or hearing the poetry, what they saw was Muslims and Hindus. What I was interested in is people actually listening to the poetry. What did they hear and what did they see? So let's take a look at that with the story of Adam. Now, the story of Adam begins with a 2-page preview of the drama of creation, and it begins in the Boyar beat. Following the creation of 7 heavens and 7 lands, a statue of Adam is sculpted from clay. Adam's form falls from the heavens to earth, and his children are as different to each other as the, quote, body and 2 eyes, arms, legs, nose, ears of a shattered statue. The poet writes, distinct in colour and shape, some were black, some were fair, some shimmered like moonlight, while others were as striking as darkness itself. Now, then there's a section after this brief intro called The Story of Abdullah's Questions. Now, this sets the stage for a lengthier history of Adam, okay? And it's sort of a frame tale that narrates a dialogue between Prophet Muhammad and his younger cousin Abdullah, whose death date is 687 CE, so you can temporally place him. Now, Abdullah here is referring to Abdullah, son of Abbas, and Abdullah is one of the earliest Muslim scholars, and his writings comprise a really important source in works of Muslim history writing. And Muslim history writing is a genre called tariq, and we will come back to that. Now, in the Qasas al-Anbiya, Abdullah asks Muhammad, where did the water come from? And then Muhammad answers, from 1 drop of sweat. And then young Abdullah asks, how was sweat created? Tell me, Prophet. And then for the remainder of the tale, the story of creation unfolds in this question and answer dialogue. That's the, you know, that's sort of this, the curtain comes up and this is the scene. Right? So the detailed story of Adam begins when angels arrive from heaven to earth seeking a fistful of dust. Trembling with fear, the earth protests. The earth protests against the angels. It pleads that any creature created from earth will only inflict destruction and ruin. But despite its protests, one angel returns to the heavens with a fistful of earth and sculpts a clay statue. And here, the poetry switches to tripodi, which is slightly slower. The pace of the story then slows and details the transformation of the statue into a sentient being. 4 angels mix musk and perfume with moist clay, and they smear the paste on the forehead of the statue, and then a spirit, or a ruh, is created. The spirit is totally unimpressed with this statue and enters it 7 times and comes back out and says, I cannot live in this. And then the 8th time, the ruh enters through the nose and then goes to the 4 quarters of the mind. And as the spirit travels through the 4 quarters of the intellect, Adam's eyes open. Now, gathered around a performer who would be reciting this kind of story in shrines, streets and verandas across Bengal, audiences heard that only when the eyes of the statue opened, life courses through the inanimate statue, altering it to a Muslim being, or janbak, as they call it in this poetry. Now, this is an account of Adam that's quite different to an account of Adam you'd get in many other places. It draws on many, many stories familiar to audiences in 19th century Bengal. On hearing these opening verses of Qasas al-Anbiya, where, you know, Adam is a statue that falls to earth and then shatters, and the different parts of the statue are nose, eyes, ears, legs. On hearing that version of the Adam story, many people would have heard the tale of Purusha. Now, Purusha is a tale that's recounted in the Rig Veda corpus of Sanskrit poetry that goes back to 1500 BC, and it's the earliest account of Purusha. And the story goes that Purusha is a being with 1,000 heads, 1,000 eyes, 1,000 feet, who falls from the heavens to earth, shattering on impact. The destruction of Purusha creates animals, trees, poetry and people, in addition to an order of things, a sort of hierarchy that Europeans began to call caste from the 16th century. Purusha is another creation story that, like Adam, has circulated across the Indian Ocean for centuries. And, you know, the most recent English translation of the Purusha story says, after Purusha shatters, the Brahman was created from his mouth, the ruler from his arms, and his thighs, that's what the freeman was. From his 2 feet, the servant was born. Okay? Now, the point is that almost every single part of the stories of the prophets kind of overlays various different stories that are circulating in Bengal. You cannot actually separate out whether or not this is a Muslim tale or a Hindu tale. Some people would listen to the story and hear the story of Purusha. Some people would hear the story and hear the story of Adam. Okay? Now, another example is on hearing the earth's pleas with the angels, you know, the earth protesting, no, don't make a man from me. Now, some listeners would have recalled the story of the earth's quarrels with Shiva, which is a story from the Mahabharata. So every single step of the way is what this book is doing is actually overlaying various different tales into this shimmering stuff that you can see what you sort of want to see, or you will recognise whatever stories it is that you know. So, unlike British officials, at performances of the Qasas al-Anbiya, gathered audiences did not necessarily see characters that were moving along a singular path of progress towards enlightenment, right? They saw characters that were moving along different temporalities. Some would see a character who is going to be reborn again and again and again. Some would see a character who belongs in Islamic temporality and is actually just going to be Adam and is going to die, and so on. But what the Qasas al-Anbiya then is doing is it's actually training listeners to inhabit these multiple different ways of seeing. The work that it does is it teaches you all these stories at once. So now you will remember that this is all happening. This poetry has been written after the mutiny, the rebellion of 1857. And this is a moment when the Mughal sovereign has been deposed by the British Empire. The Mughal sovereign is no longer the symbolic, centre of power in South Asia. This is a big moment of crisis in collective Muslim psyche across South Asia. It's in response to a new political order where there's no Mughal state, even symbolically, that a whole range of Islamic reform movements emerge alongside during the British Raj. And these are Islamic reform movements that start arbitrating between what is pure Islam and what is impure Islam. Okay? So what happens to Bengali Sufism at this moment is very much dramatised in the fiction of Kolkata-based writer Saeed Mustafa Shiraj, and he passed away in 2012, I believe. In his novel, Alik Manush, which I think it's 1996 he wrote it, an elderly man is sitting on a veranda reciting poetry when Islamic reformers waging a war on Sufism turn up to his village in North Bengal. Seeing the approaching newcomers, the man quickly discards the book that he's reading. It's a copy of Qasas al-Anbiya. Now, while many readers were discarding Sufi stories at this historical juncture, we know that one 1895 edition of Qasas al-Anbiya captivated one traveller all the way to the Australian colonies. So next I want to show you what started happening as I started sinking into the imagery of the other stories and kind of what happened in the archives. My entire relationship to archival research, in a sense, changed. Because I was reading the text, asking these two questions. With whom did a 500-page compendium of Bangla poetry cross the Indian Ocean, and what route did its stories travel to Broken Hill? So if we go to the next slide. Actually, if we could go to the next one even. Thank you. Oh, it's come up wrong. Never mind. So the second book of Qasas al-Anbiya begins with the voyage of Nuh. And many of you would know this story. In a land of unbelievers, Nuh begins to cry. No one will listen to his stories. From his tears, a sapling grows 600 yards high and 400 yards wide. When he breaks a branch from the tree to build a ship, the many birds in the tree start to shape the wood into beams, and they inscribe the names of the prophets into the wood, okay? And then he builds a ship, and when floodwaters rise, he gathers gendered pairs of animals, and he doesn't realise that the disgraced Azazel boards the ship concealed as an animal. So with 2 tigers, 2 pigeons, 2 elephants, 2 ducks, when they all arrive to a new land, so does Azazel and his lantern of darkness. And this lantern of darkness is this lamp that casts a black light and cloaks truth. So that's the way that it works in the poetry, okay? And to counter the work that Azazel does with his lantern, Allah commands Nuh, from the planks of your ship, build a mosque. From fragments of stories of the prophets, Nuh builds a house of prayer in the mountains. So as I read this story and I'm looking around in the archives, I started wondering, could the Qasas al-Anbiya have arrived to Australia with a spiritual guide or a bir? And of course, I found who it could have arrived with, Mirza Khan. There was an excerpt there that hasn't come up right, so I'll just have to tell you about him. So Mirza Khan turned up to the Australian colonies with some of the first shipments of camels, right? But the thing is, he keeps describing himself as Bengali, and I'm like, what is going on? He's working with camels, but he's speaking Bangla. He has a bookbinding business in Perth, and he has a bookbinding business in Sydney, and then after a while you get these snippets of him where he wants to establish a travelling library that goes, from mosque to mosque a mosque. So following him, what I realized is that he comes from this world of the Afghans who are actually based in Kolkata, right? So there's this entire universe of people who are at that time in Calcutta and have been living there for generations, and they claim themselves to be Afghans. It is only after 1893 that they themselves start erasing Bengal and Calcutta from their trajectory. What happens in 1893? In 1893, the Durand line is drawn between northwest British India and Afghanistan, okay? So it's a line that demarcates really sharply between British India and Afghanistan. So what you start getting then in Australia is lots of people who will say, I am from the state of Afghanistan. And they erase that they've been in Bengal for like 600 years, or their family have been in Bengal in 600 years. So there's, you know, even amongst the Afghans, there are loads and loads of Bangla speaking people. The thing is, if the book arrived with the Kamalwalas who had come through Bengal, it was also circulating with this very new proto-nationalist story about Afghans being directly connected to Afghanistan and nothing else, okay? So that was Mirza Khan, and the full story of Mirza Khan is in my book. Then, third book of the Qisas al-Anbiya tells the story of Khizr, who I'm sure many of you have heard of. Khizr is a patron of sailors. In a dark jungle, Khizr drinks from the fountain of life and becomes immortal. And for an eternity, Khizr wanders the world. His only known address is by the edge of the water. When Musa meets Khizr, Musa says to Khizr, show me your workings. How does your knowledge work, right? So Khizr leads him to the boat of a sailor and then smashes up the boat. And Musa is like, I don't understand. What have you done that for? What is going on? And then Khizr takes him aside and says, listen, that boat was about to head into the grip of power, and there was this evil king that was going to kill him. By smashing the boat, I saved him. So because of this story, Khizr has long been known as the patron saint of sailors and lost people. And every time there's a Khizrpur or a Khidirpur anywhere in Bengal or anywhere across the Indian Ocean world, it's because that's where Khizr is supposed to have been sighted, right? So as I'm reading this, I start wondering, could it be possible that a sailor who was captivated by the story of Khizr brings the Qisas al-Anbiya to Broken Hill? What do I find? Of course, I find a sailor who could have bought the Qisas al-Anbiya. So if we get to the next slide. I don't have a photo of him, but I have his handprint. This is Anu Khan. He, in 1895, basically jumps ship at Adelaide because he undertakes a giant protest against the Australian shipping company because they're getting beaten up. So you know, this book has been published in 1895, so I'm looking for Bangla sailors at this time. What do I find? I just keep finding protest after protest after protest, and these people, Lascars, who are, you know, engaging in collective action against the ship owners. And in many of them, they're actually engaging in collective action with Aboriginal dock workers in Australia. And so you get this really cosmopolitan picture of the world in which these people were moving in. So I managed to trace Anu Khan all the way to Broken Hill after he's kicked off that ship. So if the book arrived with Anu Khan, the stories of the prophets were circulating with a very powerful tale about collective action. Now, love stories. The big love story in the Qisas al-Anbiya is Yusuf Zulaykha. Okay, the fourth book tells us about Yusuf Zulaykha. In a dream, Yusuf foresees that he's going to be king, his brothers can't take it, they dump him in a well, and he is rescued and taken to Egypt. While he's being taken to Egypt, Zulaykha dreams of Yusuf, and she sets out in search for him. And the story is lengthy, and she's, you know, the search that's based on the fact that she's just seen him in a dream goes on and on and on. Now, the way that these Sufi romances actually work is that, so these Sufi romances work by never actually allowing the lover and the beloved to meet. You go through these series of realizations that are about, truths illuminated by the flame of love or ishq, or that's the philosophical underpinning of how they work. And the thing is, it's the love stories that end up being some of the most popular ones that just circulate like crazy in, in the mazars and the shrines and the places where they're being performed. So as I was reading Yusuf Zulaikha, I wondered, could the book have arrived to Australia, to Broken Hill, with a lover caught in like some sort of impossible romance that just cannot happen? Now, many romances happened along the camel tracks. If we could have the next slide. So many South Asian men married the women that they were involved with. Bija Dervish from Punjab did not marry the Aboriginal woman that he was involved with called Anne Murray. So they had a child, Ben Murray. So his Aboriginal mother is an Arabana woman, and his South Asian father, Bija Dervish, is from Punjab, as I've said. Now, he is the teller of some of the most compelling love stories that the South Asians are engaged in. But he tells them in Aboriginal languages, right? So what I started noticing was the love story archive is actually in Aboriginal languages, because the intimacies between South Asian men and Aboriginal women that are ending up in children who are illegitimate, who are not being taken care of by their South Asian fathers, these kids grow up Aboriginal, and so their archive is in Aboriginal languages. So he tells this, he traces this incredibly beautiful story of Sher Khan, who's a camel driver, also comes via Calcutta. He's a Kabuliwala who comes from via Calcutta and comes into the Australian desert. His heart is broken. In the end, Sher Khan ends up shooting the other suitor. It's over this girl called Adelaide. She's only 13. Anyway, point is, Ben Murray tells this story again and again for 70 years in 6 different Aboriginal languages, because he's an incredible storyteller and very talented in languages, and Aboriginal people speak many languages at once. So as I started looking at these Aboriginal language stories, what became really clear was, I could never see whether Sher Khan has a copy of Qasas al-Anbiya with him. What I started being able to see was that over time, this love story gets disciplined onto the river system in Australia. So like as Ben Murray gets older and older, as he tells the story and it comes back and as it goes on, you start to glimpse that the Australian river system is the index that's actually shaping how Australian Aboriginal people tell history, right? So you start getting a glimpse of what their historiographical traditions are. So then the next story, Yunus. Yunus is a tale of someone who crossed many difficult, dangerous rivers, and he gets swallowed by a whale. And then in this account of Yunus in the Qasas al-Anbiya, the whale speaks to him and gives him instructions for how to get, through when he's in the absolute grip of power and there's absolutely no hope. How will he get through? So as I'm reading, Yunus's story of again and again crossing rivers, I start wondering, could the Qasas al-Anbiya have arrived to Australian deserts with someone who navigated the perilous river system? If we could have the next slide. So of course I find Abdul Sattar, who is a cloth merchant from Hooghly. He's a chikonwala, so he's selling chikon that's being produced in Hooghly. And he is one of the many people who travel from Calcutta to Sydney, and then they go into the riverine system, and you just keep finding accounts of them walking the riverbeds. And the way that Australian rivers work is that they don't look like rivers, they're actually dry sand beds. You would think that they are these inviting paths to walk, and they flood really, really, really quickly. So the way that you find these chikonwalas is in the newspapers. Every time there's a flooding, there's the names of people who die and people, what they were selling, right? So Abdul Sattar is one of the ones who doesn't die, and he's straight from Hooghly. He makes a bit of a fortune and then comes back, and he ends up building his own business. And the entire time you can see him kind of sort of negotiating all these different categories. First he's a Lascar, then he's a cloth trader, then he's an alien, then he's this, then he's that. And so if the Kasas-Olambia arrived with someone who was navigating these rivers, it arrived with someone who knew how to survive when in the grip of power. Now, what about Aisha? The last 2 pages of the Kasas-Olambia tell us about a chain that was once lost by Aisha, Muhammad's wife. Accompanying Muhammad to the battlefield, she leaves her necklace whilst washing. She returns in the dead of night, and even though she can't see anything, she finds the chain exactly where she had left it. And the poet reminds you, because what you search for is what you will find, right? So as I'm reading this, I wonder, could the Kasas-Olambia have arrived to Broken Hill with a woman? If we could have the next slide. What do I find? When I start looking for women in the shipping records, I just find more and more and more women. This is a passenger list for Dolat. She's 23 years old and she's arrived with her son and husband, right? So she's one of the ones I'm able to trace all the way to Broken Hill. But the largest group of women who are actually travelling are ayahs. So domestic servants, and it's actually mind-boggling just how many ayahs are travelling. The thing is, the ayah, even though is understood as someone who is illiterate and would not necessarily be reading this book, in Sufi poetry itself, the ayah is the harbinger of Sufi knowledge again and again and again. She often appears in Sufi romances as the one who has the key bit of knowledge that's going to propel the protagonist, usually the prince or the princess, onto the next stage. So what we've got here is these 5 different trajectories of the way it could have arrived to Broken Hill. Now, while the reader with whom the Kasas-Olambia travelled remained concealed from view, the search for her or him revealed the contours of the architecture of Muslim South Asian knowledge spanning the Indian Ocean during the camel industry. Whether or not the Kasas-Olambia arrived to Broken Hill with any of these people in particular, together they added up to the largest circuit of moving stories that were travelling with South Asians. But it was only after gaining literacy in genres of Muslim historical storytelling that I truly began to understand the implications of what on earth I was doing. Let me illustrate by going back to the Tariq genre of historical storytelling that I told you. Tariq is Muslim history. Okay, so let's think about the pen again. Thinking about the pen, I want to show you that this mode of thinking actually has a genealogy. Tracing the genealogy of the pen to Muslim history books will actually illuminate for you the historical storytelling mode that the Kasas-Olambia itself explicitly situates itself in. So, scholars today agree that the historian Al-Tabari in 10th century Baghdad is one of the founding writers of Tariq. And if you want to understand Tariq, he's a really good place to start, okay? So I'm going to keep it very simple. So writing in the 10th century, he pens a 40-volume history in Baghdad, and it's titled The Prophets and the Kings. It's probably one of the most important works of Tariq genre of storytelling about the past. Tabari's account of the very first pen goes like this. Tabari writes, the angel Jibril said to Muhammad, quote, The first thing created by Allah is the pen. Allah said to it, write, and it proceeded at that very hour to write whatever is going to be. Now, in support of this statement, Tabari cites a chain of transmitters through whom this knowledge is travelled. So he writes that Yunus heard it from Muawiyah, who heard it from Ayyub, who heard it from Ubadah, who heard it from his father, who heard it from Muhammad. Right? So he gives the chain that it comes down from Mecca to Baghdad. Okay? Now, this chain of transmitters is known as an isnad, expressing the same idea of what the first object is, but with a slightly different phrasing. Next, Tabari writes, the first thing created by Allah is the pen. Allah commanded it to write everything, end quote. Now, he supports this statement with a completely different isnad that ultimately cites Muhammad again, right? So it's these chains of transmission that all lead back to Muhammad. Now, not everyone thinks that the pen is the first thing created. A lot of people think it's the throne. A lot of people think that it's light and dark. So by the end of Tabari's discussion of the first object, what you have is a series of chains of transmission about the first object, okay? In collating multiple isnad about the first object, Tabari's history gives us a detailed picture of the various routes along which manuscripts, stories and knowledge travelled from 7th century Mecca to 10th century Baghdad. So in my book, what I end up arguing is the 5 plausible what-ifs that I have presented to you can be thought of like a series of isnad or chains of transmission. It's a collection of the routes along which we know for certain that stories, ideas and people travelled from Bengal to Broken Hill, if not a copy of Qasas al-Anbiya. A collection of possible truth claims tells a much richer history than any singular definitive route. What I'm playing with here is the possibility of using non-European methodologies of claiming historical truth in contemporary history writing, right? Now, I'm not trying to suggest that Tabari's 10th century use of the isnad or the 12th century, varieties of tariq that arrived to South Asia, I'm not trying to say that they remain unchanged until the time of the Qasas al-Anbiya. What I do want to suggest is that we can read, respond to, creatively engage with, and claim continuity to intellectual traditions that are not those of the colonisers. Not just to study colonised peoples and the texts they produced, but to actually think using the categories, storytelling strategies, and methodologies that imperial regimes ultimately sought to displace and destroy. Now, the search for this book of Bangla Sufi poetry generated something incredibly valuable, a rich archive of other non-English language texts, in addition to the Qasas al-Anbiya, that Australian historians just do not know what to do with, because they're texts embedded in alternative knowledge systems and they work very differently, like stories work differently in this system. You get scripted into the story yourself. It's very different to how research is supposed to go, right? So why operate in this mode of historical storytelling? What does it do that histories of migrants usually can't do? Well, first, offers us an out from the boring binaries of pioneers and aliens, insiders and outsiders, Muslims and Hindus, or a range of other thought categories that are as a result of colonial legacy. Secondly, this is a mode of thinking that addresses some of the ways that histories of migrants to the West too often fail migrants today, in particular Muslim migrants. We need history books that tell us something about our knowledge traditions. We need history books that give us productive ways of starting, continuing and maintaining dialogue with our intellectual traditions. Now, in Australianama, what I end up doing is, if I have the next, I think the last slide. Oh, I've forgotten to put I've forgotten to put my book cover there. But anyway, it's on amazon.co.uk now, which is so exciting. It won't come out until next year. But in Australianama, what I end up doing is I structure every different chapter around a different language text that I found during that initial search for the, whoever bought the Bangla poetry to Broken Hill. So I deal with an Urdu manuscript, Persian dream texts, and as you've heard, some of the richest materials are in Aboriginal language sources. So half the chapters are Aboriginal language stories about the South Asians. And as you've seen, I do not argue for any kind of simple insertion of these texts into existing narratives about the migrant or about South Asians. What I'm interested in is illuminating and highlighting the architectures of knowledge that travelled with them. So it's very much a history of the imagination. And I guess ultimately the point of doing this project is in 1770, when Captain James Cook left Botany Bay, Australia, just like when colonisers left South Asia, what they left behind them is an epistemological ground from which you see the past, the present and the future. And it's an epistemological ground on which you encounter non-European knowledge systems as inferior. My argument in Australianama is just because they encountered non-European knowledge systems that way doesn't mean that we today have to. Thank you.
Wow. That was brilliant. And what I'm going to, I do have my own set of questions, but I think what I want to do is, I don't know how long we have. Carry on. But let's take a set of questions. I'll interject with my own sort of questions as well. So should we kick off? There's already a yes. Go.
First of all, thank you very much. That was actually absolutely enthralling. I didn't know a fraction of any of this, and now I'm desperate to know more about it. Can I just ask you, where are the archives mostly? Are they in England or in Australia? Where are you doing? It's a mundane question, sorry. But
No. I mean, this is the first time I've been in England. I've never been in England before. Okay. So everything's in Australia. Some of it's in Kolkata. Some of it's in Bangladesh. Mostly in Australia. So it's like one of the corollaries of Australia being incredibly, state racism being very big is that the amount of material that exists on the people they were surveilling is huge, absolutely huge. You just have to learn how to read it against the grain to not reproduce what they're doing with it. But yeah, there's a lot of archival material. And the archives, obviously the Aboriginal language sources. So in about the 1930s, they started panicking that Aboriginal languages were dying out, and it's sort of like, well, Aboriginal people are dying. But so what they did was they just created this incredible ethnographic archive where they recorded lots and lots of languages. So in those you can find lots of mentions of the South Asians, and you just listen for the names. And what you have to, obviously I don't speak any Aboriginal languages. You have to take those archives to the communities that they came from, and the stories are still circulating there. So it's a really rich, wide, diverse set of archives.
Just one more question. Did you meet any? You mentioned in somewhere else that the descendants of these people still live in and around Broken Hill, around these areas. Did you meet any of them?
Yes, of course. It's almost, along the old camel routes, it's almost unusual to find Aboriginal people who don't have South Asian ancestry. So it's actually the norm. So if you go into Aboriginal Australia and you look like me, people will go, "Oh, where are you from, sis?" And you go, "Oh, I'm from Bangladesh." And they'll go, "Oh, my great-grandfather was from Sylhet," or "Oh, my great-grandfather was from Bombay." And it's one of those things that you become quite aware of if you have contact with Aboriginal communities. It's a very long engagement.
And they're still conscious of this, obviously.
Yeah, they're very conscious of it, but there's a real politics of not talking about it because loads and loads of Aboriginal communities are consistently engaged in the politics of native title. So people have to prove that they have had, you know, Aboriginal inhabitants of a piece of land in order to get any rights to the land. So if you start claiming your great-grandfather is from Bombay, it dilutes your claim to Aboriginality. So this is the type of thing I had to be very, very, very careful about, because some of the communities I've worked with were involved in native title claims, and they were like, you can't publicly say that my great-grandfather's Bengali because that could stuff up my court case. So it's yeah, they're aware of it, but how publicly people proclaim it changes.
Can I ask a question? I was in Australia in 2004. I went to Sydney. I went to visit the. I was pretty sad there. I couldn't find any Aboriginal people in Sydney. Right? People told me to go to place. That's a good name now. In Sydney, so you go there, you'll find them. I went there and I couldn't find any. I saw some artwork, you know, on the wall, and I came back and they said, "Oh, they're probably sleeping. They were drunk last night." Right? But anyway, so I went to the Educational and Cultural Centre, Aboriginal, near really the end of Sydney. It's quite far, right? And from the station, you have to take a taxi near Blue Mountains, right? And I met this fat Aboriginal guy. He looks like Indian. He said his mother is white, right? And we had a long chat, and he actually drove me back to Sydney, you know, right? And we had a long chat. And he was telling me how many Aboriginal people, because they are, in these circumstances, they kind of feel inferior, you know, ashamed of being Aboriginal. So sometimes some of them try to make out that they're Indian or from the Indian subcontinent. He told me in a barbecue, he heard a young Aboriginal boy telling another Aboriginal, "Oh, I'm not, I'm Indian." So he took him around the corner, twisted his ear. Right? What did you say? So, is there something? Do you think there's something?
Yeah, look, I mean, the history is just so horrific and tragic. So there's a state-sponsored things that happen that mean that Aboriginal people actually have to claim their South Asian in many parts of Australia at many moments. So from the 1910s, there's actually a state policy of removing Aboriginal children from their mothers, particularly Aboriginal children who are, say, half white or half something else, because there's this idea if you remove them from their mother, they'll stop being Aboriginal and you'll be able to breed out Aboriginal people in a few generations. So in this, and you know, this goes for so these are the people who are known as the stolen generations. So in this context, many, many people, when police are turning up, trying to take children from mothers, are saying, we're not Aboriginal, we're South Asian, we're descendants of the Camel people, because then you get to stay with your mother, you get to not have your family broken apart. So there's been all these different moments at which Aboriginal people have had to use claims to South Asian heritage strategically. At this particular moment, it works the other way, where, you know, yeah. So yeah, it's incredibly, incredibly violent, what's gone on.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. Your focus was quite to the book. Can you tell us something about the community itself on 19th century, with the volume of the people in a particular place or the areas, the concentrations, the mosques and the centres, how they organise as a community kind of thing? Can you shed light on that?
Yeah, so the industries that, you got a glimpse of the threads along which the communities are organised. So there's the Laskars, the Jahajis, the camel drivers, the hawkers, and many, many women, domestic servants. Who else did we have? That's it. So the other industry is the sugarcane industry. So it's sort of like there's various different industries around which the South Asian migration is working. But what happens, as I said at the very beginning, in the 1890s, is the race-based exclusion means that many industries stop employing South Asians. So they all go into the camel industry, right? There's all these really wonderful accounts of, like rich camel merchants in the middle of Australia going, oh my God, my camel drivers are terrible. The white people think that just because they're black, they're, you know, camel people, but this guy's a rickshawala from Kolkata, and this guy's a, you know, a Marchi from, and so you basically in the end they end up collapsing into the along the camel routes. So the camel routes, the way that works is that there's one transcontinental north-south railway line and one east-west, one line bisecting the Australian continent, right? So every single railhead is a camel depot, and every single railhead sort of waits for the arrival of the train, and from there the camels go. So it's at those railheads you get the mosques. And so what, you know, you have these entire circuitry of mosques throughout the middle of Australia, and if you know when Eid is, and you can go through the newspapers and work out what it is that they're doing. So you can work out there's particular moments at which to watch for them converging, and there's just these really incredible accounts of people singing, performing, and you get a really rich picture of precisely what life was like at those nodes. But yeah.
Are those stages still vibrant with the people? Or?
Yeah, so I mean, camel transportation stops in the 1920s, in the mid-1920s, when the motor transportation comes in, but then loads of people go into trucks. So, there's this, some of the biggest families of the South Asian descendants are now some of the biggest trucking families, and and many of them can still sing songs that they remember their grandparents singing, and so there is, you know, quite amazing oral archives. Yeah.
How do they take their identity? Do they take it with pride, or do they take it as stigma? Like the
different parts of the community take it differently. So, for instance, no one wants to talk about their Lascar heritage, and
it's the opposite, because here we're quite proud now. We originally from that community, people were Lascar. So what? It's amazing history.
Yeah, of course it is. Whether or not what relationship they have to their history in some ways relates to how the museums and the public institutions treat that history. So the camel story has been now told again and again, but again, the Afghans, right? But the reason the Lascar story just breaks my heart, it's the way that the Australian immigration and discourse currently about illegals and asylum seekers works makes it quite impossible for people to actually claim their heritage as Lascars. Because essentially, if you're a Lascar in Australia, it means you arrived during the White Australia policy and you jumped ship. It means you're an illegal, right? And so there's this kind of curtain of silence around, and even people, I'd see their archival materials and I'd be like, oh my God, your grandfather did, I know him, I've been following him, but...
Well, academics like yourself doing in terms of breaking those sort of barriers and sort of empowering these people.
Yeah, well, I guess...
What's the way forward in
I think that it's about putting these histories in the hands of the people that they've come from. So, actually saying, here, this is the stuff I found about your incredible ancestor. So telling the story, not just about, so the pioneer story is what's really state-sponsored. They came and they were pioneers. But it's such a problematic story. So what, they came and they stole Aboriginal land, and the pioneer story is actually about people coming and taking land, right? No one knows these stories about Aboriginal South Asian interactions. No one knows these stories about just how ingenious these people were. So I think it's about presenting these tales in a different light that doesn't shame the people who are illegals, and that's work that my book is trying really hard to do, yeah.
The mosques that you mentioned in the depot, are they still in existence?
Yeah, so the one in Broken Hill that I went to is the best kept one. Some of them aren't in existence, some of them you can just see the ruins, and some of them are sort of, in people's backyards and just but you know that is the mosque, and there's records there, and people still know that it once was a mosque. So it varies, but there's many of them right throughout the middle of Australia.
Could you tell us just a bit more about the linguistic competences of your protagonists? What sorts of languages do they speak?
Okay, so many of them speak multiple South Asian languages. So, like you get people who are operating as translators in courts. So you get, then you get a picture of what it is that people are speaking. So many of my people from Bengal are speaking both Hindi, Urdu and Bangla. But then many of them also aren't. So you get both, so the world of Lascars, you really get to see that many people are actually writing, because that's in the court documents. They're giving their depositions in Bangla. So you get a sense of working class, and this is a very working class mobility. It's a very, apart from one or two camel merchants who have a lot of money in Karachi, most of this is incredibly working class mobility, but you do get a sense of quite a range of, written literacy. But then in terms of the spoken literacy, I guess that's a bit harder to get at, because I can't quite, But, and many of them start speaking Aboriginal languages, and so that then becomes, another.
Could you just expand a bit on the Durand line popularising people claiming Afghan heritage?
Yeah.
Was that outside the British Empire then? Was that a reason? Or?
So in 1893, there's a treaty between the government of British India and the new Afghani state, right? It's almost sort of the first partition in a sense, because it's what happens is they make an agreement that British government is not going to go any further into Afghanistan, and they make this agreement about traders being able to move back and forth, right? So what ends up happening in Australia is you get the Australian system being very racist to these Camelwallas. And they go, no. The British signed the Durand Treaty that says that anyone who's a trader can travel right across the British Empire. So
it's actually more advantageous not to be a British subject.
Yeah, so they will switch between the two. So sometimes they're going, I am a British subject, give me my British citizenship rights. After the Durand Line Treaty, anyone who has any claim to Afghan citizenship starts claiming that more, because it becomes a bit more advantageous, because they can go, particularly on the basis of if they can show that they have capital. They can go, I'm a trader. The 1893 treaty says that the British governments everywhere have to let me pass. That's what that treaty was about. So it's a real moment of, a huge upsurge in Afghani nationalism. And from that moment on, you get the Afghan sovereign, explicitly wanting its, subjects to claim direct connection to Afghanistan. So they slowly start erasing the routes that they've actually travelled.
I just wanted to say that I thought it was absolutely brilliant and really inspiring, and one of the best things that I've sat through for a really long time.
Thank you.
But I just wanted to just say that particularly the way that you set it up with all of these different, multiple levels of what is, and looking at the whole way that we approach these histories and how we interact with them is, is something that all of us should listen to. And as somebody who's been involved in Brick Lane Circle for quite a long time now, I do feel that it also fits really well into the kind of discourse that we try to have at these meetings as well, where there's, not having some sort of simple explanation for anything, but really trying to understand all of the different levels of meaning that can be coming from all sorts of different contexts. And what you spoke about is incredibly complex, so I just feel that the book itself is going to be very, very important as a text that that many of us can use in order to get some of these ideas across, because the example that you use is so brilliant, and the approach that you take is, I think, can be really accessible to lots of people.
Oh, thank you. I mean, it's, for a very long time, I thought that I had found the book and rescued it from obscurity. And then it became quite clear. It was almost as if the thing found me. Like it sort of gripped me and didn't, July 2009, and I finished writing about it July 2017. Like it has just taken over my life, and now it's just a real pleasure to be able to share these stories with people. And the way that the metaphors work is that you have to sit with them for a very long time. So I think I'm quite nervous about how it will be taken, because it's obviously quite out there. But it's just a pleasure to be sharing.
Is your book an interpretation of the poetry, or is it?
So what you just saw is basically one of the chapters, but in my actual chapter, you actually get the stories of the people that I followed. You know, the Lascar, the camel driver. So. But each of the chapters then goes through, is structured around a different language text, and kind of will tell you the history of the South Asians via, a completely other kind of storytelling method. Yeah.
Looking forward to that.
I just wondered if you could tell me a little bit more about the title, the way that we chose the name of the book. It might be obvious, but I'm thinking you probably thought deeply about it. And also, I was thinking that we're doing a bit of a history project, and I was thinking you're following narrative stories of individuals from the way you describe how you put the chapters, rather than object. Or is it the object that kind of drew you to the narratives of the stories? Because I'm just interested, if we're budding historians, what would you advise? Because we're doing a project. Ahmedullah could clarify that we're doing East India Company, and we're picking an object of that period, and from an object trying to trace a story or discover something about the narrative.
Yeah. Well, I guess I started kind of as a micro-history of the Qasas al-Anbiya because I couldn't read it. But then once I could, the nature of it changed. It sort of stopped being an object, and it itself became kind of it literally, I know this sounds mad, felt like it was an alive thing that was literally just taking me from question to question to question to question, and just revealing all these things. So yeah, I feel like I've been involved in a relationship with this book for the last 7 years, and yeah.
It's similar to what you're saying, because we are, everybody who's in the project, they have to choose an object at the Victor and Albert Museum's workers center, like Archival, near Olympia, and then they have to so you might discover something similar.
So to get to your question of how to think about, I think objects are wonderful, wonderful ways to weave together various stories. So microhistory, I guess, is the methodology that I'm thinking of. I guess when you have an object that is a book, it's a particularly articulate object. It tells its own stories. So then you just have a whole other level where you can really get into the imaginative world of someone who's shaped by that object, probably in a way that you can't with many other things. But yeah, I think it's a really wonderful teaching tool as well to get students to truly think about how far things have moved, because it gets them thinking about commodity chains and circuits and, how to hang stories on these kind of material realities that things were embedded in. Yeah, I look forward to seeing the project.
Is your book the first book to come out, or have there been other books written by Australians on those people?
Yeah, they've been written about the Afghans though, like I said, so they're very national based, so you never get a sense of, wow, these were people who had lives, wives, children, families, entire universes, and that no one migrated. People were they were going back and forth, as many of us do. And yeah, so there have been books, but yeah, the histories of the Afghans, and it's quite a different, yeah.
On this note, Samia, but first of all, thank you very much. I thought it's incredible, and it's so interesting and inspiring at so many different levels. I wondered how local historians there how they are taking your work. I mean, your work, for them would be alternative history. Have you presented anything?
Yeah, so I mean, in Broken Hill itself, the local historical society are wonderful. They're just, this little group of white nanas who meet, regularly and just look after everything prodigiously. So they're just really, really, really excited that I found this thing and I can actually explain what it is. And it's, where it gets a bit tricky is the national institutions like the National Museum of South Australia or the various places where they've been producing the minority history that I'm critiquing. I don't know. I'm not sure how they're gonna respond to it. But I've tried to limit how much I bash them in a sense, because I realise it's like if I don't say as many mean things about them in the book that I actually want to, because I realised it's like if you are able to get out of the cage that is Australia, you need to then go and explore instead of standing there and beating up the cage. Like, you're out, I'm out of Australian national consciousness. What's exciting about being out is you can see other things and you can tell new stories. So I've really tried hard not to bash them in a sense, but we will see. I don't know how they will respond.
I mean, in an academic context, given the mainstream narratives about South Asians in Australia, I mean, how do academics, for example?
Oh no, they've been very positive. So they've been really, really, really positive and I guess incredibly supportive. So this is a project that came out because in Australia they dismantled South Asian history in the 1990s. So this is a project that I did in an Australian history department. And when I said to my supervisor, I'm going to go read all these things, she was like, I have no idea how you're going to do that, how I'm going to help you, but yay, go. So they've been very supportive, but the limits of that are, if you sit on an island where there's no other people who actually know about puthis or South Asia, your work suffers. And so it's been every time I'm outside of Australia, that's when the project's really grown. So they've been very supportive. I can't fault them on that, but the real intellectual exciting leaps I've been able to take only once I'm out.
Are there any more? If not, I will take a shot with my questions.
Please.
I mean, they're not terribly exciting questions, but I wanted to know, you have the Qisas or Anbiya, and I'm wondering, did we see variations of this text over time appearing in Australia? I mean, I understand that you're looking at texts that have been brought over from other places, but I want to know whether there's a smaller printing industry that's flourishing in Australia and whether we're seeing other sort of variations of this text, whether we're seeing whether we can read this text with other texts that are being produced.
Yeah.
Is that something
So
that's happening?
you get its stories being explicitly cited, and you get its stories being explicitly cited in newspapers and at mosques, and you kind of get, sort of glimpses of that. But beyond that, there's no Bangla language printing that happen, or any language. Yes, none of the South Asian languages. So the only, I think Mandarin and Cantonese have printing presses in Australia. The Chinese community is huge, but there's not South Asian language materials produced in Australia that way. But one of the texts that I deal with is this 200-page Urdu manuscript I found, which is a Laskar's memoirs. He's from Lahore. Yeah, so he goes from Lahore to Perth, and the end of his life, he sits down and narrates the life of a Lascar turned merchant, and he does it in the form of Sinbad the Sailor. It's voyage after voyage after voyage, and it's just an incredible, incredible text. So you do have lots of texts being produced in South Asian languages by these people who are circulating, but not printed. No, and not printed like the manuscript form, if you know what I mean. Like he orates it and someone writes it down. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess the other question is, I mean, so that your work is terribly, terribly exciting. I think it's exciting because, you know, in the sense that there's not just a reading of the text itself. This is not a flat reading. There's challenging of epistemologies, but we're also looking at the futurity of these texts through sort of the oral sort of interviews. I'm assuming that you're balancing this out with oral interviews. If you can just give us a sense of what else you're doing other than looking at texts.
Sure. So I guess a lot of the really thinking about oral archives has happened in the Aboriginal language materials more so than the South Asian ones, and those ones just were exhausting because the actually stepping through Aboriginal politics, you know, land politics, etc., etc. But the oralness of that material, I think, is very specific to working in Aboriginal history because it's about the politics of how that information is used. In the South Asian chapters, I have used some recollections of people talking about their pasts, but nowhere near as much as I would have liked to. Like, there's this one story that can't go in the book that I must now tell you. So one of the terrible things is, you know, in Australian detention centres are all in remote areas. So they're in all the places that all the camel camps were. So many of the security guards who are working in detention centres descendants of the original South Asian camel drivers. So it's this bizarre scenario where there's this wonderful woman called Donna Cook who works at the so Donna Cook tells these tales about how she used to be a truck driver because she's one from these trucking families after the camel families. She's just taken photos of every single gravestone that is in Urdu or Bangla because that's the one form that you do sometimes get, you know, South Asian languages. And the only way she can work out who they're the gravestones of is because of the refugees who she imprisons. Like, she sits there working with them, transcribing them, and I'm just like, I don't even know what to say about that. And she's got these incredibly heartwarming stories of these people just starting, you know, going, why on earth is there someone in the Australian desert who died in 1892 from my village that I've just escaped from, you know, like as a refugee, like how is this history exist and why are we still being incarcerated? Like, so there's this incredible. I guess I'm really, really, really hoping that this book coming out is the beginning of a number of projects that does what was sort of hinted at before about changing the public discourse, like doing, you know, like what do I do with the book once it comes out with the communities who it actually implicates? Yeah, so that's what's ahead.
Last question from me before I hand it back to the audience again. So we have the Qisas ul Anbiya, but there's other puthis coming out. There's Delaramir puthi, Shunabanir puthi, Abu Shamarir puthi, and I'm just wondering if those actually make it across. You know, and there's also puthis in Sylheti Nagari that's coming out. There's, you know, I found sort of texts, but much later in the Maimansingha dialect, and I'm wondering if these are, you know, if you've had people saying, you know, well, I come from Sylhet, or I'm just wondering what sort of other texts are circulating other than these Urdu, sort of the Urdu manuscript, the Persian dream text that you talked about, which is really exciting.
Yes, so there's like, there's a lot of Gurmukhi written text, so clearly people are using different languages as accounting text. Sylhet Nagari, I haven't found any actual texts, but the most incredible archive is the Battle of Karbala moments in ports in Sydney from 1801. There's accounts of people doing the, you know, like, yeah. So because colonials are freaking out, going, what are you doing? But you know, the Lascar, the record that these people left, and many of them are from Sylhet, Noakhali, contemporary Bangladesh. So that's the only kind of record I can find of them. I haven't to date haven't found any written things that they've written. But yeah.
It's more yet to be found.
Yes.
There's one hand up, so yeah.
What's the, after the project, obviously the project's come to a close now because you've published the book. What's your next endeavour? Are you still going to stick to the same genre, or are you moving on to something else?
I need to get out of Australia, so I just can't be. I mean, so when the book comes out, maybe it'll be kind of slightly easier to return there. But I feel that I need to spend a little bit of time outside of Australia. So the project that I started in the British Library, and Lily was there as it was budding and beginning, was that it turns out there's this like giant number of Bangla letters from the Dhaka factory to its regional arongs in the 1790s. So one of the weird things about having done this project is I can now read Old Bangla and I know what the... Sorry?
You have to explain arongs.
Oh, sorry. I'm so inside the archives. So the Dhaka factory was so the textiles orders would go to Calcutta from Britain, and from there to, say, a Dhaka factory or Hooghly factory. And then from Dhaka factory, they would go to the regional centre. So, Bajitpur or Jongolbari in Moimunshing, or there's about 6 or 7 regional centres in where the actual weaving is being done. And at each of these weaving centres, there's this head guy called the Gomashta, and his letters back and forth between him and the Dhaka factory are all in the British Library for the years 1792 and 1800, and they have the most incredible amount of detail about the lives of the weavers and spinners. So the spinners are the women and the weavers are the men. So I want to do a project to do with textile industries, and tie it and frame it in terms of this is a history of the contemporary ready-made garments industry in Bangladesh today. So that's where I'm headed.
Mohammed informed me or enlightened you that I've already done a project.
Yes, it's a wonderful, wonderful book. Thank you.
I haven't given you the book, have I?
Oh, I'm talking about I got the really, extremely well-produced muslin book, but you haven't given me... Yeah, but you haven't given me the one that you guys made, no.
All right, I'll give you.
Yeah.
Are you around? I can run to the office and get it.
Yeah, of course.
I was going to ask you something. From 1790, what kind of Bangla were they writing at that time? 1790?
So it's actually correspondence. So
what kind of language was that?
Currently, to me, it feels like a very Persianized Bangla, because I think they've actually taken the Persian letter form and then they're doing it in Bangla, because the entire administrative system is what the Mughal system had in place before the East India Company comes and colonizes that. No, they're using Bangla script. They're using Bangla script, but some of the language forms they're using would be categorized as Madhya Juger Bangla, as opposed to modern Bangla. Middle age or middle age Bangla. But that's, it's a whole other project, and next.
I was just thinking of the contemporary equivalent is probably NGOs speak English. It's going between factories and people ordering clothes.
Yeah, I don't know.
And so it would be even more divorced from the people making it, unless you can get video interviews with people in factories.
I would ask you, the kind of dialect, which dialect was that they using? Kutti, Dhaka Kutti, or something else?
So,
Was correspondent?
look, I can't actually tell
I'm
yet.
joking, yeah,
Right. I mean, it's just the 18th century is like a whole new world. I'm just like, whoa.
It's interesting to see what kind of local, because standard Bangla wasn't developed at that time.
Yeah.
So just started, the process, what language, what version they might have used.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the rate I'm going, it clearly takes me 8 years to do a project. So invite me back in 8 years' time and I'll be able to answer all your questions.
Yeah, definitely sounds like an invitation that's going to happen. On that note, I think that I'd like to get everyone to join us in thanking Samia for a wonderful talk, and we hope to see her in 8 years' time if not sooner.